Okay, sorry.
Okay, we're back to Jacob,
Okay.
the supplanter, deceiver.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a real character, isn't he?
Yeah.
Of course, his mother, he's a kind of a mama's boy too, and his mother connives with him to deceive his father out of the father's blessing. So Jacob, or Isaac, seems like must be an old man by this time.
Oh, yeah.
He's blind, and it's when Jacob comes in, they prepare this special meal that he likes, kill the venison and bring it to him, and he asks his father to get up, which sounds like he must have been bedfast. So he's not only blind, but probably bedfast and near death. And so this is his final blessing. And in verse 4, we read that Rebecca, let's see, no, that's not it. Verses 4 and 7. That doesn't make any sense. It's a little farther than that. Way on down. He had asked for this meal to be prepared, and he was going to go out and prepare some kind of game, but he just killed one of the goats on it. And so Isaac was kind of surprised that he got there so quick. He says, how is it, verse 20, how is it you found it so quickly, my son? And he says, well, the Lord your God granted me success. The Lord has been with me. That's how. This is all a scam I'm setting up. That's how I did it so quick. But he credits the Lord with his getting it done so quickly. So he had Jacob come near. He says, come near and kiss me. In verse 27, he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments. You might wonder why Jacob needed to put his brother's garments on. Remember, he put the skin over him, because it seems like Rebekah may have guessed that old Isaac might have been suspicious and would want to smell, not only feel him, but he could smell that animal skin, or he smelled Esau's. He had Esau's clothing on, actually. And verses 28, 29, and 39 and 40, he has this blessing. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may all your mother's sons bow down to you, and cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. Now, if you're going down to verses 39 and 40, Esau comes back in and realizes what's happened, and he begs his father for a blessing. And he says in verse 38, have you only one blessing, Father? Bless me also, Father, he cries, and Esau lifted up his voice and wept. His father does answer him and give him a blessing. But notice the difference in the blessing. See, away from the fatness of the earth shall your home be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother, but when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck. Now, Isaac can pray for material prosperity for both of his sons. That phrase, the fat of the earth, is used in both of the fatness of the earth, that they would both be blessed to be prosperous materially. But he cannot pray for overlordship for both of them. The dominance can't be shared. I mean, one's over the other one,
right.
And Jacob receives that blessing of the dominance and overlordship. So Esau lost his blessing. Jacob deceived Isaac to get the blessing. Of course, we'll find out later Jacob gets deceived pretty well himself, doesn't he?
Yeah.
By his future father-in-law. So kind of what goes around comes around, right? Then we go into chapter 28, and there's a confirmation of the covenant with Jacob, so that now the covenant has been confirmed not only with Abraham, the covenant to bless him and to give him the land of Canaan, to make him a blessing and to bless the nations of the earth. And in verse 4, before he sends Jacob away, there was this threat that Esau was going to kill him, and so that to avoid this battle between them, or one of them, or maybe both of them, they'd kill one another. They sent Rebekah wanted to send, or was it Isaac wanted to send the boy? Isaac called Jacob and blessed him. Didn't want him to marry one of the people there, so he sent him away to their homeland where Abraham had come from. Padan Aram, verse 5. And Esau in verse 9 had taken one of the took a daughter of Abraham's son Ishmael and sister Naomi to be his wife. In addition to wives he had, I don't know how many wives he already had. All these guys were polygamous, right? And verses 10 and following, we have this dream where there's this ladder set up reaching to the top of heaven. I've read some translators who say it really doesn't. It's a ladder. It's a kind of a ramp reaching up, and they think maybe it's kind of like one of those temples that he sees. You know, that back in chapter 11 they're going to build a temple, a ziggurat they were called, reaching up to heaven. But in verses 13 and through 15, the Lord also confirms the blessings of the covenant. God spoke to him in that dream that night, verse 13. I am the Lord, this Yahweh, capital L, capital O, capital R-D. I am Yahweh. I am the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. And the land on which you lie I will give you, the promise of the land. You're going to be multiplied. Verse 14, your offspring will be like the dust of the earth. You'll spread to the west, east, north, and south. And finally, all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. So here's this promise of blessing from the covenant blessings. They were given originally to Abraham, confirmed later to Isaac, and now in this vision they're confirmed to Jacob. Verses 18 through 22 are really interesting. We'll talk about that in a minute ago. In verse 20, Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me, then I will, and if he will keep me in the way, And if he will give me bread and eat and clothing to wear, then the Lord shall be my God. So he's
trying to make a deal.
He's trying to make a deal out of this covenant.
Not a good idea.
The Lord promised it to Abraham, and I promised it to Isaac. Didn't he? He promised it to Jacob. He just promised it. But then Isaac is the one who says, well, if this really comes about, then I will serve the Lord. I will serve the God of my father and the God of my grandfather. If he does what he says he will do.
How'd that turn out for you?
Robert Alter, in his translation, the 5 books of Moses, says, Jacob remains the suspicious bargainer. He's a wrestler with words and conditions. Now he wants to be sure God will fill his side of the bargain before he commits himself to the God's service. You know, Lord, if you'll come through now, then I'll follow you.
Some arrogance there, isn't there?
But,
So there's some arrogance there, isn't there?
well, that's
Anyway, tried to put
you
conditions
wonder,
on God.
why would God go ahead and confirm the covenant to him? Some character like that. Well, it's clear all the way along that God's promise here doesn't really have anything to do with the moral character
Right.
or the performance of the individual, whether it's Abraham or Abraham to start with.
That's true.
You know, in fact, there's lots of evidence that Abraham was probably an idolater, worshipped many gods. We'll see when Jacob goes back over to where Abraham lived originally, that his son-in-law, his nephew Laban, right? Rachel took the household gods when they left later.
Yeah.
And apparently they were still worshiping these little gods. So Jacob, in chapter 29, he gets back to his home country, where his grandfather immigrated from originally, years before. And he's now dealing with Laban and Laban's family, the nephew of Abraham himself. And Laban has a couple of daughters, and Jacob is, like all men, is attracted to female beauty, right? But Leah, the oldest daughter, she doesn't compare too favorably with Rachel, the younger daughter. Rachel says was both beautiful and she was well proportioned, had a nice figure, it says. she was not only attractive, but she stacked up really nice. And but Leah had weak eyes. Now that word in the Hebrew is a kind of a peculiar word. It isn't found, I don't think that it's found anywhere else in the Old Testament. I read somewhere. But it seems to mean soft or gentle, tender or weak. And it could be taken as referring either to an impairment or something odd in her appearance. But there was something about her eyes. But anyway, Rachel is described as being beautiful and really having a nice figure. And but Laban says, no, you can't. Of course, you can't take the younger daughter. That's not appropriate. You have to work for her. He does agree to give him Rachel, but you got to work for her 7 years. Now you'd really have to love a girl, I guess, to work for 7 years just to get her, right? And after 7 years, he's getting pretty horny. Verse 21, he was ready to go to bed with her, it says. He told Laban, I'm ready to get in bed with Rachel. Yep. I think the translation is ready to make love. It's literally to go to bed with. And then, of course, they have the wedding ceremony, and then he doesn't even see her. I guess she's veiled during the wedding, but then at night he sleeps with her, and they make love during the night. In the morning, wakes up, he sees who he's in bed with, right? He's in bed with Leah,
Yeah.
not with Rachel. He's been deceived.
Must be a pretty dark room.
Should be drinking so much wine.
Yep.
A lot of wine. It was real dark.
Well, probably there wasn't any light at all. They were just, you can do it without any light, right? You can do it by feel. And I ran across this Jewish interpretation called the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah. This is one interpretation of this passage. Jacob, who can't see the woman with whom he is sleeping, he cries out in the night, Rachel, Rachel, Rachel. And Leah answers him, yes, yes, yes. And then by the light of day, when he realizes that he's been tricked, Leah reminded him, well, isn't this how your father cried out, Esau? Esau? And you answered him. In other words, what I've done to you is exactly the same thing you did to your father.
So she knew what kind of guy he was when she married him.
It's called karma.
You'd hope that reputation wouldn't precede you, but apparently there was nothing to talk about but gossip, so everybody knew.
In chapter 30, first 24 verses, we get into the birth of their various children that were born. And these children then will become the patriarchs of the ancestors of the 12 tribes, right? Rachel could not have children. When he had to work 7 more years, by the way, but he did get Rachel finally. 7 more years, and we read later that he says he worked a total of 20 years. So apparently he worked 7 years for, ended up getting Leah, had to work 7 more years for Rachel, 14, and then apparently he stayed on another 6 years working for his father-in-law. But Rachel wasn't having any children. She was barren, and she was very jealous of her sister. Here you get this family dynamics. It's not a good idea to have more than one wife, guys. You may get tired of the one you've got, but
You know what the punishment is?
bring it on the second one or a
You
third
know,
one.
you know what the punishment is for
What?
having 2 wives, don't you? You get 2 mother-in-laws. Oh,
Well, I guess in Jacob's case, since they were sisters, he only had one mother-in-law.
yeah, well, that's true.
I was in a Rotary meeting Wednesday, and they'd inducted this gal into the meeting, and she was introducing herself, talking about her history. And I forget whether she said she'd been married 3 times or 5 times, but it had been numerous times, more than once. And she said, I'm not a quitter.
Yeah. That's one way to look at it.
Like the old country song where the guy goes, I wish I was in Joe's shoes. I wish that was Joe's. Just always talked about how pretty Joe's wife was. Well, he got Joe's wife away from Joe, and he ended up with her. At the end of the song, he says, "I wish Joe had his shoes back."
Sounds like a country song.
And Rachel kind of seems like she's blaming Jacob because she can't have children. She says to Jacob, "Give me children, or I'll die." You know, it's a terrible curse. We find that over and over several times in the scripture. We found it with the woman who gave birth to Samuel, right, who was barren for a while and prayed, and then God blessed her. The scripture sees children, of course, as a blessing from God, and the lack of children are really a curse. But she says to Jacob, "Give me children." And Jacob was angry. He says, "Do you think I'm God? He's the one. God has kept you from having children. Don't talk to me about this." And so she said, "Well, here's my servant Bilhah. Sleep with her, go to bed with her, so that she can have children for me." This is the same kind of arrangement we saw with Abraham and Hagar, right? So this apparently was a rather common social kind of thing to do. A little different from our.
Yeah.
Although we do have surrogate mothers now, don't we?
Yeah.
Where people can't have a baby. They take the.
We have all kinds of strange combinations these days.
But most of the time, it's usually just artificial insemination that by the guy's sperm. So she became pregnant, and she had a son, and she called him Dan, the first one, Dan. He has listened to my prayer, and the word Dan is connected to the word listen. God has heard her, listened to her. She had another son. She called him Naphtali. Now Leah saw that she had stopped having children, but doesn't mention who her children were, or were they mentioned earlier? They were mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, in chapter 29. She gave her servant Zilpah to Jacob. So Jacob, is consorting with Rachel, with Leah, with Rachel's servant, with Leah's servant. So, right, and so these sons are all by really 4 different women, aren't they? But they're all children of Jacob. And while it says one day when the wheat was being harvested, Reuben, that was one of Leah's children. She was having babies. We didn't see that back in chapter 29. And he found some mandrakes and brought them to his mother. Rachel said to Leah, "Give me some of your son's mandrakes." She says, "So mother, you're taking away my husband. Are you going to take my son's mandrakes too?" Mandrakes were thought to have some medicinal property. They were fruits, looked a little bit like a tomato. It's supposed to have some medicinal property, and also aphrodisiac, make you more sexual, increase your sexual desire, and also make you more fertile. So Rachel was asking for some of these mandrakes. But then Rachel said, "Okay, Jacob can sleep with you tonight if you give me some of your son's mandrakes." This is an implication maybe that Leah had been put aside. he wasn't even cohabiting with her, was rejecting her. So she said, if you'll give me some of these, so maybe this will make me fertile, then I'll let you sleep with him. More the dynamics of polygamy. Who gets to sleep with who tonight? So God listened to Leah. So Jacob did sleep with her, and the child that was born was Issachar. And she became pregnant again. The boy was named Zebulun. And then she had a daughter named Dinah, verse 21. And she had another son, and that was a son named Joseph. Joseph will become leading character a little bit later here. Now, in verses 25 and following, Jacob is ready to go back home. He says, give me my wives and children. He says, I've worked for you. I'll be on my way. You know how much I've done for you. But Laban wanted them to stay on for a while. He says, I know the Lord has blessed you. Apparently, Jacob was a pretty good with animals. And Laban's flocks are prospering, and so Laban wants them to stay on and work for him longer. And Laban asked him, well, what can I give you for all this? He says, don't give me anything, verse 31, just do one thing for me. Let me go through all your flocks one day and remove every speckle or spotted lamb, and they will be my pay. Now we're talking about a real deal maker. Are most sheep spotted black? Most sheep are white, aren't they?
Yeah.
Excuse me, just want to let you know, my husband's here.
Well, praise the Lord.
He's home from the hospital. He's doing much better.
Oh, good.
Thank you very much.
So, what kind of deal is this? Let me just have the speckled sheep. Well, only a very few would have that characteristic color. So Laban is thinking, this kid's pretty stupid, isn't he? If that's all he wants.
Yeah, years ago, when my dad had this little farm down in Arcadia, he was looking for a little male goat, and a neighbor of mine had a little goat that was black and white spotted. I mean, looked like a Dalmatian dog, a little male goat. So I bought it, took it down for Dad, and that was probably the most popular goat in the area. When my mother's health went bad and he had to sell out, everybody wanted to buy that little buck because he was so beautiful. And he said, you get everything else. You buy him, you get everything else.
What a deal.
Yeah, but very unique. He was very unique.
Yeah, he was pretty special, wasn't he?
Yeah, it was very special.
So it says that so he ended up taking the speckled animals, and Laban ended up taking the all white, which was the majority of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then look at verse 36. He put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. He left and specifies 3 days because he's taking his flocks away to make sure there wouldn't be any crossbreeding. He didn't want Jacob to get any more because he could crossbreed, and maybe some of the white sheep ewes would bear a speckled lamb. And then Jacob then, as he began his breeding operation, he took these popular branches and peeled off the bark, and he placed them in the tub where the animals drank, so that they would be right in front of the flocks when they came to drink and when they would mate. And so when they mated, they were looking at these branches, and then they gave birth to striped, spotted, speckled, or spotted little ones. Yeah.
What a conniver.
Good morning.
Hey, how you doing, Mia? Good to see you.
I have a note here. Go back there. But I was thinking about this. The women's desire to have children and feeling cursed without children, seeing children as a blessing. I'm thinking of this verse in Psalm 127. I've got it down to the bottom of the first page. Psalm 127, verses 3 and 4. Children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from Him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. And so, conversely, a barren womb was considered a terrible curse. And then this question occurred to me. What does this imply about a culture that sees children as a burden and finds itself with a declining population? And I looked up some birth rates down in the footnote at the bottom of the page. The birth rate in 2019 in the United States, per woman, 1.7. On average, every woman in the United States 2019 would over her lifetime have 1.7 children. Well, how many children would it take, though, to keep the population level? You can't do it at 1.7 because she's got to replace herself and her husband, right?
Yep.
And since many children, or some children, will die in childbirth or early on, it has to be a little more than 2,
Right.
2.1 or 2.07 or something. China is also 1.7, although they've got a problem. We've got too many boys and don't have enough girls.
Right.
In the United Kingdom, it's 1.6. Japan, 1.4. Korea, 0.9.
Wow.
And they're just not having babies at all in Korea. Look at the sub-Saharan Africa, 4.9.
You're repopulating the
Africans are
world.
going to take over the world.
Oh, yeah. There was an interesting video that came out, Islamic demographics, and they talked about the spread of Islam to the world. This is where at 2.4
Yeah.
to maintain a culture. It talks about all these figures. And Islam is like, in the actual families, is like 7.2.
It's really high.
Because
Yeah,
the idea is to move into the country, mass populate, and take
Right.
under control.
Right.
That's what they've done in Europe.
Yeah, Muslims, observant Muslims anyway, do tend to have more children. And I sometimes even counsel young couples. No, I don't want them to have children. And I've only heard people say that in the last maybe 10 or 15 years. I know I would not want to have children. Right. Do you remember when you were growing up 30, 40 years ago, hearing people say, no, I do not want to have children?
I went to school with 2 good Catholic girls. Their families, Van Papkins and Van Leaders, whose dads were engineers. Van Papkins had 16 kids. Van Leaders had 17. I was invited to dinner one night. I'd never seen anything like it. I thought it was a restaurant.
But I'm asking you, do any of y'all remember? I'm just wondering, do you remember years ago hearing young people say when they got married, we do not want to have children?
Never heard that. Never
Boy,
heard that.
was, well, when are you going to start having family?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
You know, there's something wrong with you for not having
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah.
Well, but
Yeah.
did you know any couples who said, who were never planned to have any?
Show you how much the media makes things.
Not really.
So what's going on there?
This Saturday is the Pinellas County, Pinellas Park Christmas parade. They had to skip it one year, but they had it every year. It's really a lot of fun. People really turn out. I asked my grandson. I said, "You want to go to the parade because he does karate and they're in the parade. You ride the float." And he goes, "No." He says, "Not with what happens in these parades. You don't know what's going to happen." With a guy running through the walk-and-shop parade. He goes, "No." He says, "You hurt kids."
What?
Because that guy that ran through the parade,
Okay.
kids see it on the
Mowed
news,
down the-
he didn't want to go to the parade.
That's sad. You know, it really is.
But what is it? What is there going on? Isn't it kind of natural to want to have children? Isn't that kind of part of our nature?
Yeah.
In Genesis, there is that command. You know, it's like kind of like a command to multiply. You remember that? That's the first thing God told Adam, wasn't it? That's the first commandment in the Bible.
I can
But
think
in a
of
way, it's not really a commandment. It's just it's a way of saying that I have made you. In fact, all of the animals have that, don't they? That God wanted, He wanted the animals to multiply. He wanted them to flourish.
I can think of in our immediate family, there's two couples, married couples, that neither of them want children. They've said that from the day they were married. No, they don't want kids.
But you would not have seen that 30, 40
No,
years ago.
no, you wouldn't.
And in rural areas with farms, it used to be you had a big family, and the family worked the farm.
Yes, exactly. Oh yes, yes we did.
Yes, we did.
And I think it's part of that thing where if you're a man, you don't even have to be a man. You can be whatever you want to be. You don't have to follow. You don't have to be what nature has made you. If nature has made you to be a man, you don't have to be a man. If he made you a woman, you don't have to be a woman. If he made you to have children, you don't need to have children.
You can be whatever you want to be.
Yeah. Back to chapter 30, where Jacob has made this bargain, and then he starts this breeding technique using these these poles with the bark stripped off of them. We don't know really what this is all about. Some think it may reflect a belief that the mother's sensory impression at the moment of conception would affect the appearance of the embryo. However, if you look at chapter 31, verses 3 through 12, just run back on over to chapter 31, Jacob explains it really in a different way. Chapter 31. He says, he talks about what Laban had done to him, and then at the end of verse 7 he says, but God hasn't let him harm me. And sometimes Laban would say the speckled ones will be your pay. But this is mentioned that this was kind of like what Laban was saying all along. I'll just give you the speckled ones, the striped ones. So he says, God has taken away your father's livestock, now I'm giving them to me. And in verse 11, it talks about God said to me in a dream, Jacob, And Jacob answered, here I am. He said, look around. You see the male goats mating with the flock. All of them have stripes. And he said, he's sort of attributing this to something God had revealed to him and that God was blessing him. But going back up to verse 1, it says that Jacob's, Laban's son, were reporting to their father about how much wealth he had gained. And that it really was supposed to belong to their father. And he's taking note of the potential threat, the envy of Laban and his father-in-law, and he decides to steal away home, back home, back to Canaan anyway. And so he leaves kind of in the middle of the night, takes his wives, his concubines, and his animals. By this time, he's got a large number of flocks. And Rachel even steals the family's household gods. The word here is called teraphim. There is another word for God, Elohim, but it's not the word for God. It's how they're little figurines, represented deities responsible for the well-being of the prosperity of the household. It looks like Rachel was not really a firm believer in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She says, I want to take these little deities that we use at home and perhaps have been using. I don't know how they used them, but they were supposed to protect them and keep them prosperous. Later, then Laban takes out after Jacob, catches up with him, and accuses him of slipping out at night that way. And then the worst thing is now you've taken our household gods, you've taken our teraphim. And Jacob denies that. Rachel has done this without his knowing. He says, you can look, search. So Laban goes through the tents, gets to Rachel's tent, and she's not there. She's gotten on her camel. And she said she was in the way of women. She was in her menstrual period. She'd taken the little teraphim, stuck them under her butt, and sat on the camel. Which, I don't know, what does that say about the gods?
Yeah, right. Yep.
That's like, would you take your Bible and sit on it? Not very respectful, is it? But Jacob complains that Laban had taken advantage of him for 20 years. And then he says, in verse 42, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac. This phrase, the fear of Isaac, which Robert Alter in his translation, he translates that the terror of Isaac. Doesn't mean, it means the God whom Isaac feared. The terror of Isaac. If it hadn't been for the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac, which is found here, only that phrase, fear of Isaac or terror of Isaac, and in verse 54, it's only found twice. God is not described that way anywhere else. But somehow or other in Jacob, that's his phrase, that's the way he describes the God of Abraham, Isaac, and the God that he is worshiping. If it had not been for him, that God, you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God, he knows that God has kept him and blessed him. And then I have a quotation here. And the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's not the witch in the wardrobe. Well, it's the lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Aslam is a Christ figure. Have any of y'all read any of those little books? There's a series of 7 of them.
The Chronicles.
Yeah, Chronicles of Narnia.
Right.
Yeah, if you haven't, I encourage you to read. They were kind of originally, you think, as children's stories, but they are really worth reading as adults. And they got a lot of Christian symbolism and a lot of the gospel message. Now, Aslan, see, is the Christ figure. He comes back to deliver the land of Narnia from its bondage and oppression. Aslan has come back. And there was a passage where we read, "Safe," question, "Safe," said Mr. Beaver. The animals are talking in Narnia. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you?" She's talking to one of the children who were in Narnia. "Who said anything about safe? Aslan being safe. Who said anything about Aslan, this lion, being safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. He's not safe. He's a terror, but he's good."
He's a lion. C.S. Lewis is an interesting person.
Do we think of God as being a terror?
Do we?
We think of the fear of God. Our God is a consuming fire. Isn't that something we read in the New Testament even?
Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
But he is good. He is good.
In that context, isn't the fear really respect? I mean, isn't it you respect him as?
But you read even in the New Testament, there were times where Jesus would do something, and where is it? One of the passages where Peter says, "Depart from me, I'm a sinful man." There's something about Jesus even who is human. You know, he's a man, but there's something about what he's doing that you remember when he cast all the demons out of the pigs. The people in that country said, "Please, we hope you will leave." This is too much for us to get a handle on. We don't understand this. What's going on here? It's pretty scary. Well, sometimes we get God domesticated. Sweet baby Jesus.
Yeah.
Particularly in Christmas time, you know.
Yeah, right.
That was one of the interesting parts about EE. And when you're going out and talk to people, and they said, "Well, my God wouldn't do that. My God would only do this and this." And they said, "That's called idolatry.
Right.
You've created God in your own image. You need to read and learn what God is first."
Is your God the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Is that your God? But what's really important here, over and over again, we see the covenant promises, don't we? Made to Abraham, then they were made later on to Isaac, now again to Jacob. Through all of these stories, some of which are really bizarre to us, have nothing. They're not lifting up. There's nothing about lifting up these men as heroes or as people that we should admire as such. But it's letting us know that God is using these people. Through them, He's doing something that ultimately will bless all the nations of the world.